Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, your home for forgotten moments of American history. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss these haunting stories from the past. Now, let us step back into the year 1874, where a young girl's mysterious illness would become one of history's most unspoken secrets. In the year 1874, the American nation was still young, but already carrying heavy scars of war, of hunger, and of restless change that swept through towns and countryside like an unrelenting wind. The Civil War had ended less than a decade before, yet its shadows remained etched into families, into the very wood of the homes, and in the weary faces of men who had once been boys on battlefields. Farms stretched wide under a sun that could both give and take away. Small towns rang with the voices of church bells and merchants calling from shop doors. And at night, the lamps flickered dim against the vast, unknowable dark. Amid this landscape of healing and hardship, stories often whispered in hushed tones were the ones that clung most stubbornly to memory. And one such story, though time and the careful silence of doctors tried to erase it, has lived on in fragments spoken of in corners, recorded in scattered notes, and carried by the uneasy weight of those who were there. It was the story of a young girl whose illness, her very diagnosis, was so unsettling that it was hidden, locked away, classified as though the words themselves might infect those who dared to speak them. The girl was not born into wealth, nor into abject poverty, but into that fragile place between, where survival depended on the turning of seasons and the strength of her family's hands. Her father was a carpenter, a man of rough skill who shaped wood with the patience of someone who understood both its beauty and its stubbornness. Her mother was gentle but sharp, a woman who carried the burden of keeping the home steady and the children clothed when money was thin. They lived in a modest house near the edges of a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where church sermons and market days carried more weight than distant politics, and where everyone knew one another by name. The girl herself, her name rarely written, but sometimes whispered as Clara, was about 12 years old when the first signs appeared. She had been a bright, curious child, quick to smile, quick to question, with that restless energy of youth that made her a favorite among neighbors. But in the winter of 1874, something changed. It began subtly, in ways her mother at first dismissed as fatigue, perhaps the result of chores and school lessons. Clara would come home pale, her eyes heavy as though sleep was always just beyond her reach. She began to complain of aches deep in her bones, pains that no poultice nor herbal tea seemed to ease. At night, her breathing grew restless, and strange sounds, half moans, half murmurs, would echo through the small rooms of the house. At first, the family turned to prayer, as many did in those days when medicine was uncertain and faith was sometimes the only anchor. The local pastor laid his hand on her head, whispering blessings as her mother wept quietly nearby. Yet the weeks stretched on, and Clara's condition worsened. Her once bright eyes grew sunken, her skin grew sallow, and she began to withdraw from the chatter of her siblings, preferring to sit alone in silence, as though something heavy and unseen was pressing against her mind. Her father, though reluctant, finally called upon the town's doctor, a man named Dr. Whitaker, who was well respected for his knowledge, but often burdened by the limits of what he could actually cure. He examined Clara with grave patience, listening to her heartbeat, peering into her eyes, asking questions in a voice that grew more troubled with each answer. In the dim light of the kitchen, her parents watched him, desperate for reassurance. But when at last he rose, his face was pale, and his words were careful, measured. "She is unwell," he said softly, "but not in the way we commonly treat. There are signs I cannot easily name." Those words lodged like stones in the hearts of Clara's parents. What did it mean? Signs that could not be named. In an age when even pneumonia could kill, when fevers swept through homes and left graveyards dotted with small headstones. The idea that an illness was unnameable carried its own terror. But more than that, there was something in the doctor's hesitation. A shadow behind his eyes that suggested this was not merely a sickness of the body. In the weeks that followed, Clara's decline became more unsettling. She began to speak in ways that unsettled her family, muttering words that seemed not her own, lapsing into silences so deep her mother would shake her gently just to see if she would stir. At times, she cried out at night, speaking of shapes in the corners of her room, of voices calling her name. The family tried to soothe her, but fear was growing. Not only of what might take her life, but of what might already have taken hold of her mind. Neighbors, always curious and quick to whisper, began to speak of the girl in worried tones. Some said she was afflicted by a wasting disease, perhaps consumption, the curse that had carried so many young away. Others whispered darker possibilities, the kind of talk that was rarely voiced openly but always lingered beneath the surface in small towns where superstition ran alongside faith. They spoke of curses, of madness, of the devil's hand at work. For the family, already burdened by worry, such whispers were like salt in a wound. Dr. Whitaker returned often, sometimes with other men of medicine. Men from neighboring towns or traveling physicians who prided themselves on their knowledge. Each one examined Clara, each one asked their questions, and each one left with furrowed brows and heavy silence. Notes were written in small, careful script, but the words were rarely shared aloud. What was clear, even to the family, was that something about Clara's illness unsettled these men, made them uneasy in a way that went beyond their usual frustrations with disease. There was something here they did not wish to name, something they believed was better hidden than revealed. And so the girl's suffering continued, stretching through the cold winter months, each day blurring into the next. Her once strong voice grew frail, her body thinner, her spirit flickering like a candle in the wind. Her mother sat beside her often, brushing her damp hair back from her face, whispering lullabies she had sung when Clara was a baby. Her father, though he tried to stay strong, was often seen outside the house, his head bowed, his rough hands trembling as though no wood, no hammer, no nail could steady him in the face of what he could not repair. But still, through all of this, the doctors came and went, leaving behind more silence than answers. Their notes, kept carefully, would later be stored away, marked in ways that hinted at classification, at secrecy. As though even history itself must be shielded from this case. And in that silence, the weight of mystery grew heavier. It was said that by spring of that year, Clara's condition reached a point that could no longer be ignored, even by those who wished to keep it hidden. Something happened in those final weeks, something the family never fully spoke of, something the doctors recorded only in cautious language. And though the truth of what occurred may never be fully known, the echoes of it remain, carried down like a chill in the air, a story that resists being forgotten, and it is here, in the fragile balance between memory and silence, that Clara's story begins to take on the weight of legend. For what afflicted her was not merely a sickness of the body, nor entirely of the mind, but something that unsettled even the doctors who dared to look too closely. The spring of 1874 came late that year, as though winter itself had no desire to release its hold. The snow melted slowly, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud, and the gray skies lingered above the town with a weight that matched the mood inside the little carpenter's house. By then, Clara was scarcely recognizable as the girl who had once run through the fields with her hair streaming behind her, calling to the other children with a voice that rang like a bell. Now, her body seemed folded into itself, thin and brittle, her face pale against the faded pillowcase. Her mother still clung to hope, smoothing the sheets around her, whispering prayers under her breath as she dipped cloths in cool water to lay upon Clara's burning forehead. But in the corners of the room, in the way her father kept his eyes lowered, in the silence of her siblings who no longer dared to ask when she would come outside again. There was a quiet acceptance that something unnatural had taken root at night. The illness became most dreadful. Clara would toss and turn, her breathing ragged, her lips moving with words her mother often could not understand. Sometimes the words sounded foreign, sharp syllables that did not belong in the mouth of a child who had barely traveled beyond her town. At other times, she would whisper her father's name over and over until he came to her bedside, only for her to turn her head away as though she no longer recognized him. And still, the voices she claimed to hear continued. She told her mother that women stood at her bedside, whispering secrets into her ears, secrets she could never repeat. Other times, she said there was a man in the corner, silent, his face hidden, watching her without end. These visions terrified her mother. But what frightened her even more was the way Clara's eyes seemed fixed on things no one else could see. The way she would raise a trembling hand as though reaching into an invisible world that had no place in their small home by then. Dr. Whitaker was no longer coming alone. He brought men from the city, men with dark coats and leather satchels, men who carried themselves with authority and spoke in low, urgent tones. They examined Clara with instruments unfamiliar to her parents, peered at her eyes with polished lenses, and placed cold hands upon her chest as they listened to her faltering breath. Yet for all their study, for all their whispered debates behind the closed kitchen door, none would speak plainly of what afflicted her. They wrote notes, exchanged glances, and one even instructed the parents to say as little as possible about what was happening within their home. For her dignity, one physician had murmured, though his eyes betrayed a fear that suggested something far greater than dignity was at stake. Neighbors had not been blind to these comings and goings. They saw the carriages from the city, the strangers entering and leaving the house, the way the family kept the curtains drawn even during the day. In a town where every cough or fever was known and discussed, the secrecy was like a spark to dry straw. Rumors grew quickly, feeding upon themselves. Some said Clara was possessed, that the devil had claimed her for reasons unknown. Others claimed she had inherited madness from some hidden branch of her family tree, a curse passed silently down through blood. A few whispered darker things still, that she was a warning, a punishment sent upon the town itself. Children were warned not to linger near the carpenter's home, and mothers pulled their little ones close when Clara's name was mentioned at the market. What had once been pity was now giving way to unease, even fear inside the home. The weight of isolation pressed heavily. Clara's siblings grew quiet, uncertain of what to say, uncertain of whether their sister even remained the same girl they had loved. Her father's work began to falter, his hands unsteady on the wood, his mind clouded with thoughts he could not share. And her mother, worn by sleepless nights and endless worry, began to look as though the illness was spreading to her as well, her eyes hollow, her cheeks sunken. The family had once been woven tightly together by love and hard work. But now it seemed as though the threads were unraveling under the strain of a burden no one could name what struck those who saw. Clara most deeply was not only her suffering, but the way her illness seemed to exist beyond the reach of ordinary sickness. She was not fevered always, nor coughing endlessly, nor wasting away in the familiar patterns of consumption or influenza. Instead, her suffering came in waves, unpredictable, each new episode stranger than the last. Sometimes she would sit up suddenly, her eyes wide, and speak in a voice not quite her own, lower, older, as though some other presence had slipped into her frail body. Other times she would fall into silence so deep that her mother feared her gone, only for her to awaken hours later as though nothing had happened. It was this strangeness, this unexplainable shifting between what seemed physical and what seemed beyond, that unnerved the doctors most of all. By the middle of spring, one of the visiting physicians, a man from St. Louis, returned for a second examination. He was older than the others, his hair grayed, his manner steady. But when he left Clara's bedside, he lingered long in the kitchen with Dr. Whitaker. The two men spoke in voices too low to be clearly heard. But Clara's father, standing by the window, caught fragments of their words, hallucinations, disturbance, not to be recorded openly. At last, the older doctor turned to him with a face lined by sorrow and placed a hand on his shoulder. "There are times," he said slowly, "when it is better for a family to carry its burden in silence. Not all illnesses are meant to be known." These words, more than any diagnosis, struck terror into Clara's father. For what could be so dreadful, so unfit to name, that even men of science would rather hide it than speak it aloud? He carried that question with him in the days that followed, through the hammering of nails and the sawing of wood, through the sleepless nights where his daughter's cries echoed in his ears. And with each passing day, the mystery grew, feeding upon the silence of those who should have offered answers by May. Clara's body grew weaker still, but the strange episodes did not cease. If anything, they deepened. There were nights when her voice could be heard not only within the house, but drifting into the street, rising in tones of pleading or despair, words that made those who overheard them shiver. One neighbor swore she heard the girl call out names not known in the town, names of people long dead. Another claimed she heard Clara laugh in the dead of night, a laugh so sharp and wild it made the dogs howl. These accounts spread quickly, feeding the sense that something uncanny was happening within those walls. The family, desperate and afraid, turned once more to faith. The pastor returned, this time with elders from the church. And together they prayed over Clara, their voices rising in unison as though to drown out the whispers that seemed to cling to her. But even their prayers seemed to falter when Clara's eyes opened in the midst of their pleas, her gaze fixed upon them with an intensity that silenced the room. For a moment it seemed she might speak, but instead she turned her head away and closed her eyes, leaving them shaken, unsure if they had brought comfort or only stirred the shadows deeper by early summer. Clara's story was no longer just her family's. It belonged to the town, carried in rumor and fear, in the whispers of children and the cautious glances of adults. And it belonged to the doctors, who continued to visit, to write, to classify without ever naming. In time, those notes would be gathered, marked, and set aside, hidden from open record. But in the moment, in that fragile span of months in 1874, Clara's life hung in the balance, her illness a mystery that no one dared to explain, her suffering a mirror for fears too deep to be spoken. And as the summer heat rose, pressing down upon the small town and its weary families, Clara's own fire burned lower, flickering toward a darkness that seemed both inevitable and yet unbearable to accept. Something was drawing near, something the doctors feared, something her parents could not stop, and something the town would never forget. The summer of 1874 pressed itself into every corner of the little town, heavy and relentless. The heat clung to the clapboard houses, to the dirt streets where dust rose in slow clouds behind wagon wheels, and to the weary faces of farmers who worked under a sun that seemed determined to scorch the earth itself. The air hung thick, and even the birds fell silent during the long afternoons. Inside the carpenter's home, where the curtains stayed drawn and the air smelled faintly of damp cloth and fever, the heat was suffocating. Clara lay upon her narrow bed, her hair plastered to her temples, her breath shallow. Her mother fanned her with a worn piece of paper, whispering soft prayers, though her lips trembled as she spoke them. Her father sat nearby, his rough hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles shone white. It was in these days that the weight of dread settled fully upon them. For they knew with a certainty that whatever held their daughter was nearing its final grip. The episodes that had once come in waves now lingered, stretching longer and leaving Clara caught between worlds. At times she seemed distant, her eyes fixed upon things no one else could see, her lips moving with words too faint to understand. At other times, her body shook as though seized by unseen hands, her voice rising in tones that chilled even the most devout hearts. One night, she cried out so suddenly and so sharply that her siblings awoke in terror, clutching one another as her voice rang through the house. When her mother rushed to her side, Clara's eyes were wide, and she whispered, "They are calling me." They will not stop calling. She begged her mother not to let them take her. Though who they were, no one could say the doctors returned still, though less often now. Their faces were grave, their words carefully chosen, and their visits brought no comfort. Each time they left, Clara's father asked them for answers, but the answers never came. Only silence, only vague phrases like an affliction of the mind or a condition not yet understood. Once, in his desperation, her father demanded to know if it was madness, if his daughter had lost her reason. The doctor's eyes had flickered with something like pity before he said softly, "It is not madness in the way you think. But it is not something we should speak of beyond these walls." That was all he would say. And it left the father trembling, for silence was more terrifying than any name as the weeks dragged on. The town's whispers grew louder. Some claimed the family had brought this upon themselves, that hidden sins had drawn divine punishment. Others swore they had seen strange lights flickering in the carpenter's windows at night. Though impressed, none could explain what they had seen. Children dared one another to creep close to the house. But none lasted long, for the sound of Clara's cries drifting into the night was enough to send them running. The pastor, though he visited, began to avoid speaking of Clara in his sermons, as though even from the pulpit the subject was too heavy, too unclean. In time, the family found themselves shunned, left to carry their burden alone, a burden that seemed heavier with each passing day by late July. Clara's body had grown so frail she could barely rise from her bed. Yet in her weakness, the strange visions only deepened. She began to speak of people who had come to her, people no one else could see. Sometimes she described them with such detail, faces lined with age, clothing out of fashion, voices low and insistent that her mother shuddered, certain that Clara was seeing the dead. One evening, as the last light of the sun fell across the room, Clara lifted her thin hand toward the window and whispered, "He is here." When asked who, she only said, "The man in the dark coat," before closing her eyes and sinking once more into silence that night. Her father, unable to bear it, stayed awake beside her bed, his candle flickering low. He kept his gaze fixed upon the corner where Clara had pointed, and though he saw nothing, a coldness crept into his bones as though the shadows themselves were pressing closer. When at last Clara stirred and reached for him, whispering his name with a trembling voice, he took her hand and vowed he would not leave her, no matter what came. But even as he spoke the words, he felt powerless. A man skilled in shaping wood, but helpless in shaping fate. It was in early August that the event occurred. The one never fully written in any medical record. The one that would haunt those who witnessed it until their last days. It began in the middle of the night, when Clara awoke with a scream so piercing it carried through the quiet streets. Her mother rushed to her side, her siblings huddling in fear, and her father lit the lamp with trembling hands. What they saw was Clara sitting upright, her eyes wide but unseeing, her lips moving with words that spilled too quickly to understand. Her voice rose and fell in strange cadences, at times low and guttural, at times high and sharp, as though many voices were pouring through her. The air in the room grew heavy, and though the summer night was hot, a chill seemed to fall over them all. Her mother clutched her hand, pleading with her to stop. But Clara's gaze never wavered from the corner of the room, the same corner where she had so often claimed someone stood. Her father, his heart pounding, stepped forward, but as he did, Clara's head turned sharply toward him, her voice suddenly clear. "Do not let them take me," she cried. "Do not let them take me into the dark." Then, with a strength her frail body should not have had, she thrashed against the bedclothes, her hands clawing at the air as though fighting unseen hands. Her father and mother held her down, tears streaming from their eyes. But it seemed as though she was locked in a struggle beyond their reach. The doctors were summoned. But by the time they arrived, Clara had fallen into a deep stillness. Her breathing shallow, her body limp. They examined her, their faces pale in the lamplight, their notes scribbled quickly and with urgency. But none would speak plainly of what had happened. Only one, a younger doctor with trembling hands, muttered, "This should not be written." His words were hushed, yet Clara's father heard them clearly. And they lodged in his heart like a stone for days after. Clara hovered between life and death. Sometimes she opened her eyes and whispered faintly. Sometimes she lay so still her mother feared she had gone. And yet she lingered, caught in that fragile space where every breath felt both miraculous and unbearable. Her siblings no longer dared enter the room, and even her father found it difficult to stand at her bedside for long. For the sight of her once vibrant daughter reduced to such frailty was more than he could bear. Only her mother remained, steadfast, whispering prayers even as her voice cracked with grief. The town, by now, avoided the house altogether. Neighbors crossed to the other side of the street. Children hurried past with eyes averted, and even the pastor came less often. The family was alone, the weight of their suffering carried in silence. And the doctors, though they came, did little more than observe, their faces grim, their words guarded. Whatever they saw, whatever they believed was happening to Clara, they refused to share. Their notes, later gathered, would be marked in ways that suggested secrecy, classification, a deliberate attempt to keep the truth hidden. But for the family, no mark on paper could capture the reality of what they lived through: the cries in the night, the visions of things unseen, the slow fading of a girl they loved more than life itself. And so the summer waned, and Clara's fire burned lower with each passing day. The days were long, the nights longer still, filled with the sound of her shallow breaths and her mother's whispered pleas. And though hope still lingered faintly, it was hope carried more by love than by reason. For all could see that the end was drawing near. What remained unknown was what that end would bring, and whether it would answer the mystery or bury it forever in silence. The final weeks of that summer settled over the little carpenter's home like a slow and unrelenting shadow. The heat did not relent, and neither did the heaviness within those walls. Clara no longer spoke often, and when she did, her words were faint, sometimes broken, sometimes slipping into murmurs that only her mother could hear if she pressed her ear close. The strength that had once burst from her, the girl who had run through fields and laughed in the sun, was nearly gone, replaced by a fragile shell that seemed too light for this world. Her father no longer worked his carpentry, his tools lying untouched in the shed. He spent his days in silence, sitting near the window, watching the road as though waiting for something he could not name. Her mother, thin and hollow-eyed, sat beside her daughter day and night, her hand never far from Clara's. Her prayers whispered until her voice was hoarse. It was during one of those long, oppressive nights in late August when Clara stirred from her stillness and turned her face toward her mother. Her eyes, though sunken, shone with a strange clarity, as though for the first time in months she had been freed from whatever shadow held her. She whispered softly, "Mama, they are waiting for me." Her mother's heart clenched, and she asked who, though her voice trembled even as she said it. Clara's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. A child's smile, tender and innocent, so unlike the haunted expressions that had filled the summer. "The women," she said, her voice weak but certain. "They are kind now. They say I will not hurt any more." Tears ran down her mother's face as she pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. Holding her close, though her heart broke with each word by dawn, Clara was gone. She slipped away quietly, her breathing slowing until it was no more, leaving behind only the stillness of a room heavy with grief. Her mother's cries filled the house, raw and unrestrained, while her father sat frozen, unable to move, his hands trembling in his lap. Her siblings clung to one another, silent in their fear and sorrow. The doctors came, their faces grim, their hands busy with notes and quiet words. But there was no comfort in their presence. When at last they left, they carried with them more than their satchels and papers. They carried the mystery of Clara, the burden of knowledge they would not share. The decision to classify her case in silence rather than speak of it openly, the burial was small, quiet, almost secret. Few neighbors came, for though they pitied the family, fear and superstition still hung heavy in their hearts. The pastor spoke briefly, his words cautious, as though uncertain how to frame the life of a child marked by such a strange affliction. Her father lowered his head, his hat in his hands, while her mother wept openly, clutching the little cross that hung at her neck. The grave was dug at the edge of the churchyard, the soil fresh and dark, the marker plain. No long sermons were given, no great declarations of hope. Only the heavy silence of a community uneasy with what they had witnessed and unwilling to name it aloud in the weeks that followed. Life in the town moved on, as it always did. The markets bustled again, the fields yielded their harvests, and the children played in the dust of the roads. But for the carpenter's family, nothing was the same. Their home felt hollow, each corner echoing with the memory of Clara's voice. Her mother, though she tried, never regained her strength. She grew quieter, thinner, as though a part of her had been buried with her child. Her father returned to his work in time, but his hands were slower, his shoulders stooped, his eyes dulled. The laughter of their other children returned gradually, but always in softer tones, always with the knowledge that something had been taken from them that could not be restored as for the doctors. Their silence remained. The notes they kept, filled with careful descriptions and observations, were never published, never discussed openly in journals. Instead, they were stored away, marked and hidden, as though Clara's case was something unfit for the world to know. Perhaps they feared ridicule, for medicine in 1874 was still fragile, still uncertain, and to admit to a case that defied understanding might expose their limits. Or perhaps, as some would later believe, they feared the truth itself that Clara's illness was not an ordinary affliction, but something far stranger, something that reached beyond the boundaries of body and mind into realms they dared not name. Whatever their reasons, the result was the same. Clara's diagnosis was classified, silenced, buried along with her body in the quiet earth of that churchyard down yet. Stories have a way of surviving even when paper does not. The neighbors, though they shunned the family, carried whispers with them. The pastor, though cautious, carried memory. And the family, though broken, carried their grief in ways that could not be hidden. Over time, fragments of Clara's story slipped into the wider world, into family records, into stray mentions in letters, into hushed conversations that surfaced when the night was long and the fire burned low. Each telling added its own shadows, its own interpretations, until the truth itself blurred. Was she afflicted with a rare disease of the mind, something unknown to science in that day? Was she prey to hallucinations and seizures that no doctor could yet name? Or was it something darker, something that defied even the language of medicine, something that touched upon the mysteries people feared most? No answer was ever written, and so the mystery endures. Clara remains, even now, a child caught in silence, her story half buried but never fully erased. She is remembered not in monuments or books, but in the weight of whispers, in the unease that comes when history leaves its questions unanswered. Her father passed with sorrow still heavy in his heart. Her mother faded slowly. Her siblings grew and carried on, but the memory of that summer never left them. And though the doctors tried to close the book upon her with their careful notes and classifications, the story slipped free, finding its way into the currents of history, waiting to be heard again. So we return to 1874, to that small house in a small town, to the carpenter's daughter whose laughter once filled the fields, but whose end was shrouded in mystery. Her life was short, her suffering great, her memory fragile. But her story lingers, not because of what was written, but because of what was not. In the silence of doctors, in the unease of neighbors, in the grief of a family, Clara's mystery lives as a reminder that not all of history is clear, not all of it is comfortable, and some of it, like her illness, remains unspoken.